Chapter 8 Return and End. About the end of August 325, Alexander left Patala on his return westwards to make preparations beforehand for the provisioning of the fleet when it arrived. While Nearchus was to wait for the setting in of the northeast monsoons in October, at first he traversed the country of the Arabatai and Oriete, who were subdued after much fighting. A satrap, Apollophanes, was appointed, and Hephaestion was left behind with orders to found an Alexander city and connection with Rahambalia, the chief village of the Orete. Leonastus, who was to await the fleet on the coast, was to found a second Alexandria there. Alexander now plunged into Gedrosian desert, and the further he went, the greater were the privations and sufferings of the army. The complete barrenness and absence of water on the coast made it necessary to go further inland, so that the intention of establishing depots for the fleet would not be carried out. The burning heat rendered it impossible to march except by night. Scouts were sent to the sea, described the wretched ichthyophagi, fish-eaters, who subsisted on mussels and lived in huts. On went the army, suffering from hunger and thirst, and the maintenance of discipline became more and more difficult. But Alexander was indulgent, having humane regard to the plight of his men. By thousands they lay down by the roadside, and horses and mules were killed and eaten. Very rarely could food be procured from villages further inland. Finally they were able to follow the coast again, when good water and food could be depended upon, and then they passed through more fruitful regions into the interior. They reached Pura, the capital of Gedrosia, 60 days after leaving the country of the Orete. If here and there the descriptions of the sufferings of the troops are rhetorical embroidered, on the whole they do not seem to be exaggerated. Alexander marched on foot with them, and, by his example, and by sharing all privations as their comrade, did his utmost to keep up the courage and perseverance of his men. When some soldiers, who had been lucky enough to find water, offered it to him in a helmet, he praised them, but poured the water into the sand. This invigorated the whole army, says Arrian, as much as if they had all drunk the water he had poured away. How great were his losses in men and animals cannot be calculated, as it is not known how many he started with from Patala, but they must have been appallingly large. It is stated that the women and children who accompanied the army suffered most. Even here in the sandy desert of Baluchistan, Alexander caused his scientists to observe the flora of the desert, and we possess many of their observations. It is also interesting to read that the Phoenician merchants, who were in the baggage train, used the opportunity to collect the resin from the myrrh bushes and the scented roots of the spikenards, whose value they knew from the home market. In the plenty of Pura, the survivors of the army were able to get through refreshment and rest. The subjection of further Asia was thus completed by the conquest of Gedrosia, and this country was placed under a satrap, Sibirtius, and united in one satrapy with Arachosia, which bounded it on the north. About the beginning of December 325, Alexander started to march westwards to Carmania, which had given him its submission in 330, when he was in Persis, but on which he had not yet set foot. In Carmania, according to arrangement, Craterus met him, with his division of the army and all the elephants. He had left India by the Mula and Bolan passes, gone by way Arachosian Alexandria, Kandahar, and Drangiana, subdued rebels, among them Ardennes, whom he now had with him in chains, and had then proceeded into Carmania to keep his rendezvous with Alexander. So, except for those who had perished in Gedrosia and the troops left behind in India, the whole field army was reunited. After the great losses in Gedrosia, the large numbers of camels and beasts of burden, brought by Stazanor, the satrap of Aria and Drangiana, were very welcome. After joining Craterus, Alexander held a festival of thanksgiving for the conquest of India and their preservation from the deserts of Gedrosia. Sacrifices were offered to the gods, and a musical and gymnastic contest held. Puercastas, who had saved the king's life in the citadel of the Malay, was enrolled as the 8th of the royal bodyguard. These festivities and the joyous mood of the army after its recent preservation gave rise to the legend, which we may trace back to the fertile imagination of Eclecticus, that Alexander and his troops marched through Carmania in a bacchanalian revel of 7 days in imitation of the triumphal procession of Dionysus. While in Carmania, Alexander was relieved of his great anxiety for the fleet, of whose fate he had not yet heard. Nearchus had had to leave a month earlier than was arranged with Alexander, because of the threatening attitude of the Indian population after the king's departure. He sailed about 20th of September 325, before the setting in of the northeastern monsoons. The consequence was that shortly afterwards, on the coast of the Arabate, he was becalmed for 24 days amid great privations until the hoped-for winds arrived. On the basis of the log which he kept, he subsequently wrote an account of his voyage of discovery, of which we have in Addian's Indice, a much abbreviated but very valuable extract. We have in particular the notes of the various points at which the fleet put in, so that we can follow the voyage from day to day with its chief experiences. On the other hand, we have lost most of the descriptions, which by Alexander's orders Nearchus gave of the flora and fauna, the customs of the natives, the formation of the coast, and much besides. But we hear, for example, of a people which was unacquainted with iron and used sharp stones, and thus was still in the Stone Age. It is to Nearchus that we owe the valuable passage about the mangroves of the Persian Gulf and Theophrastus's On Plants. On the whole, the voyage was successful, without much loss of ships, and only once was armed resistance encountered. Nevertheless, from want of food and especially of drinking water, the crews often suffered severely. They soon became accustomed to the alternation of the tides, but at the first sight of whales there was terror and consternation. When they saw the great columns of water, which seemed to them to be hurled forth as if from machines, they asked the native pilots what it meant, and when they were told that these were blown up by large animals, the oars fell from their hands for fright. At Nearchus' command, they charged at the whales with their prows as if for a sea fight, and by their war cries, with which, as Nearchus later wrote, they gave themselves courage, and by their trumpet blast they scared the creatures into diving down to the depths. After this and other exciting experiences, they reached the strata Hamosea, or Mus, and, when opposite the Carmanian coast, saw the Arabian promontory Makata, Rasmusendam. Onius Thecritus, who, as on the Indus fleet, was steersman of the admiral's ship, wanted to follow the coast of Arabia instead of entering the Persian Gulf. But Nearchus, as his superior officer, abruptly refused this, pointing to Alexander's instructions. A few days later, his dutiful behavior was rewarded. Near Ormuz, when he reached the mouth of the Anamis, he heard that Alexander was only 5 days' march away in the interior. Nearchus' tale of the manner in which he met his king is very touching in its simplicity and is one of the gems of the literature about Alexander. Some of his people had encountered a Greek who had repaired from Alexander's camp to the shore. Deep emotion seized them when they saw a Greek once more and heard him speak Greek. With joy, they led him to Nearchus, who thereupon agreed with the commander of the coast that the man should take him to Alexander. But while Nearchus was drawing his vessels on shore and surrounding them with a rampart, the Greek, in the hope of reward, hurried on by the shortest way to give the king the joyful news of the arrival of the fleet. Alexander at first was highly delighted, but as days went by without the coming of Nearchus, he became ever more impatient, till finally, believing the man had deceived him, he had him arrested. Meanwhile, some messengers sent out by Alexander met Nearchus, who, with Archias, the second in command of the fleet, and 5 others, had started off without a guide into the interior to look for Alexander's camp. But Nearchus and his companions were so changed by the fatigues of the expedition, pale and emaciated, with long hair and ragged clothes, that the messengers did not recognize them. They were about to pass by, when, at Archias's advice, Nearchus asked them where they were going, and when they said they were looking for Nearchus and the fleet, Nearchus said to them, "I am Nearchus, and this is Archias. Be our guides. We want to tell Alexander about the voyage." Thereupon the messengers took them in their chariots and drove them to the camp, and announced to the king that Nearchus and Archias with 5 men had come, but they were unable to answer Alexander's question about the fleet. Then the king believed that the whole fleet was destroyed, and when Nearchus and his companions came before him, hardly recognizing them, he gave his right hand to his friend Nearchus, took him aside, and wept for a long time. At last he said, "You and Archias, at any rate, are saved. That is a comfort in my disaster. But how did the ships and crews perish?" When Nearchus replied that the fleet and men were safe, Alexander wept more, and swore by Zeus of the Hellenes and Ammon of the Libyans, that he rejoiced more over this message than over the conquest of all Asia. We must thank Nearchus for lifting the veil from this touching scene, which took place in private, and for thus giving us a deep insight into the human side of Alexander. A great festival was held. Thank offerings for the preservation of the fleet were made to Zeus, the Savior, to Heracles, to Apollo, averter of evil, Poseidon, and all the gods of the sea, and musical and gymnastic competitions were again held. When a procession followed, Nearchus was at its head, and the rejoicing army covered him with flowers and gay ribbons. He was the hero of the day. Only at the urgent request of Nearchus did Alexander leave him in command of the fleet to take it to its destination at Susa, for he was very loth to expose his friend again to the dangers of a sea voyage. So Nearchus continued the voyage. Hephaestion was commissioned to march to Persia by the southerly road, where good provision was to be obtained. With the bulk of the army and the elephants, Alexander himself, with the light troops and the heteroi, set out by a more northerly road direct to Passagarde, where he arrived at the beginning of the year 324. More than 5 years had elapsed since he first visited Passagarde, then still as the commander-in-chief of the Corinthian League, who was about to declare the Pan-Hellenic campaign at an end. He returned as the paramount great king of Asia, who, far beyond the limits of the Achaemenid Empire, had conquered India, and at the mouth of the Indus had reached the limit of the inhabited world. Not only battle and victory lay behind him, but many a severe collision with men who had been his closest friends. The bitter experience that only few in his suite understood, and approved the policy of comprehension which became ever more dominant in his mind, was bound to weigh heavily on him and make him severe and reserved. He must have felt as a relief the rain of tears that his impulsive nature drew from him when he met Nearchus, one of those few. Severe and hard had been his attitude in Carmania, when the first news reached him of insubordination among some imperial officials. The further west he came, the more numerous were the reports that because of his long absence, several of his satraps, in the belief that he would not return, or on false rumors that he had perished, had been guilty of the plunderings of temples or the oppression of his subjects. It was high time that he got back and reduced them to order. He proceeded against the miscreants with iron severity, so that by stern punishment he might warn others against following the bad example. The Mede Baraxes, who was brought to him at Passagarde in chains by the Median satrap Atropates, was executed with his whole following, because he had put the tiara upright on his head in royal fashion and usurped the title of great king of the Medes and Persians. Alexander also was extremely indignant when he revisited the tomb of Cyrus the Great to find the sepulchral chamber plundered and laid waste and the corpse torn out of its coffin. He tortured the Magians who were in charge, but as they could not be convicted, he let them go free and commissioned Aristobulus to restore the damage. He, in his History of Alexander, expressly reports on this incident and has left us a very valuable description of the still extant building and its condition at the time. When Alexander left Pasargadae for the neighboring Persepolis, he had Oxenes hanged. After the death of Pharasartes, this man had usurped the satrapy of Persis, and was now convicted of having plundered the royal graves and sanctuaries, and of having put to death many Persians without trial. Piacetas was appointed satrap in his place. He seemed to be specially appropriate for the cradle of the Persian nation, because he alone of the Macedonians had assumed Median dress and Persian customs, and had learned the Persian language. We are told by Arrian that as Alexander grazed on the ruin of the palaces of Persepolis, which he had formerly set on fire, he did not praise their destruction. Then he had not shrunk from sacrificing these wonderful buildings to the Pan-Hellenic idea, in order to take vengeance for the crimes of Xerxes. How distant from him now were such thoughts! What did he care for the Pan-Hellenic idea, which he had once accepted with enthusiasm, himself carried out, and then discarded forever? Since then, he had followed his second aim only, the winning of Asia for himself and for Greek civilization, and one can conceive how regret seized him, that he had not left standing these proud monuments of his predecessors, witnesses to the high culture attained by the old Achaemenid Empire. From Persepolis, Alexander marched to Susa. Shortly before he reached the city, about February 324, he met Nearchus and his fleet at the bridge of boats by which his army was to cross the Passatigris. Nearchus had successfully sailed along the Persian Gulf to the mouth of the Euphrates, and then at the news of Alexander's approach had gone up the Passatigris to the bridge. There was great rejoicing on the reunion of the army and crews, who had not seen each other since they left India. Sacrifices were offered to the gods in thanksgiving for the preservation of the fleet, and games celebrated. Nearchus, who was again covered by the army with flowers and ribbons, received from Alexander the highest distinction of a golden crown, and Leonatus the same for his victory over the Aretae. After Hephaestion had also joined them, the victorious army was granted a long rest at Susa, there, if not before, under the title Telarch, which he also bore as colonel of the first hipparchy of the Heteroi. Hephaestion was given the position of a Persian Grand Vizier, so that officially he had precedence after the king. At Susa, also bad news came in concerning disorders in the empire. Not only had the oriental satraps of the eastern parts taken advantage of the king's long absence, but his Macedonian satraps as well in the west had somewhat exceeded their authority by enlisting large bodies of mercenaries. Alexander immediately ordered the mercenaries to be dismissed, and by taking other measures of the greatest severity, quickly restored order. Only one of these offenders succeeded in escaping his tribunal of punishment, the old friend of his youth, Harpalus, who had been left at Ecbatana in 330 as imperial treasurer, and had later removed to Babylon, taking the treasure with him. The longer Alexander stayed away, the more impudently did he employ Alexander's treasure for his own extravagant life. He lived riotously with the Athenian courtesan Phaeontines, and when she died, he built a temple and altar to her as Phaeontinis Aphrodite, a frivolous precursor of the Hellenistic apotheosis, and not only in Babylon, but also near Athens, on the sacred way to Ulysses. Paid many talents for costly tombs to be erected to her. Subsequently, he lived for a time in the royal castle at Tarsus with another Athenian, Glycera, and made the people do praesokinesis to her as queen. These shameless pranks were brought to an abrupt end by Alexander's return. As Harpalus could not hope for pardon, his only safety was in flight. He hit on the mad idea of staging a rebellion of Athens against Alexander by the use of Alexander's own money. And with 30 ships of war, an army of 6,000 mercenaries, which he enlisted in the course of years, and a capital of 5,000 talents from the treasury, he made his way to Greece. All this was destined to entail far-reaching consequences. During this stay at Susa, which lasted many months, and in the spring of summer of 324, are to be placed certain actions of Alexander, by which he gave clear expression to the thoughts which had ripened in his mind about his policy in Asia and about his relations to Greece. On the one hand, we have the so-called mass marriage of Susa, and on the other, the demand he made of the Greeks for his apotheosis and the decree on the restoration of the exiles. In connection with his marriage to Roxane, it was pointed out that it was the first indication that out of the military necessity of drafting Persians and other Iranians into his army, and under the influence of his maturing plans for world domination, the idea had grown up in him that these nations should be combined with his Macedonians into a dominant people, to whom he could entrust the defense of his Asiatic empire, for which his Macedonians alone were not sufficient. After his success in India, the more he was occupied with schemes of world domination, the more he seems to have become absorbed in the project of amalgamation of the nations. Here it is to be noticed, though it is often overlooked, that Alexander did not aim at a universal world fraternity, but exclusively at an intermingling of his Macedonians with the Persians, heretofore the ruling nation, and with the Medes their kinsmen and the other Iranians, but not with the Semites, Anatolians, Egyptians, and other races. At Susa he expressed his idea with unmistakable plainness, in an act of symbolic meaning before all the world, by arranging for himself and 80 Macedonians who were nearest to his person marriages with Persian and Iranian princesses and daughters of magnates, with unprecedented pomp. A gigantic royal tent, in which Alexander was wont to hold his audiences, was erected on the model of the Persian Apadana, and the marriage ceremonies performed in it after the Persian rite, just as in the case of Roxane, the Bactrian rite had been used. Chares, the court-martial, has left us valuable information both about this structure and the solemnities of the day. Alexander himself married Stateria, a daughter of Darius, certainly with the added motive of legitimizing his sovereignty over Asia in the eyes of the Orientals, by alliance with the former ruling house, and his dearest friend Hephaestion married her sister Drypetis, because Alexander wanted their children to be cousins. Alexander himself provided the dowry for each of the young bridegrooms. In addition, he gave wedding presents to the ordinary Macedonians, who then or previously had taken Asiatic wives. We are told that inquiry established their number as exceeding 10,000. But, in spite of all their king's generosity, his Macedonians grumbled when those young Persians named Epigonai, who had in the meantime been trained in Macedonian fashion, were paraded before him at Susa to the number of 30,000 and incorporated as a separate unit in the army. What specially annoyed them was that in the reorganization of the army, which was a necessity after the return from India, Alexander, first in the case of the cavalry, proceeded from a system of parallel Macedonian and Persian formations to a mixture of both races in one, and went so far as to receive Persians and Iranians into the proud Agama Guard. The temperature became sultry and ominous, and anger gained strength among the Macedonians against their commander, who seemed to them ever more and more like an Asiatic great king. To remedy this discontent, Alexander announced that he wished to pay back the debts which they had contracted in camp life during the campaign. But it became evident that their confidence in him had been shaken. For when he ordered that the debtors should declare in writing their names and the amounts of their debts, many were afraid to do this. They feared he only wanted to find out which of them had not found their pay sufficient. The mistrust of his troops wounded him most deeply, and he told them that a king might only speak the truth to his subjects, and the subjects might only expect truth from their king. He then commanded that the money should be paid out to them, without the necessity of giving their names in writing. From Susa, Alexander turned his attention again to affairs in Greece. Since the defeat of Agis and the infliction of punishment on the Spartans, he had had neither time nor cause to occupy himself with Hellas. Though after the ending of the Pan-Hellenic War of Vengeance, he still was hegemon of the Corinthian League. Yet through the colossal success of the last years and through the extension of his empire to India, the relation of power between the hegemon and the Greek allies had altered very much to their disadvantage. Conscious of these superhuman and extraordinary achievements, Alexander now issued from Susa the request that he should be recognized as a god by the Greek allies. To understand this step, we must first remove certain misinterpretations which it has received. It is a widespread error that Alexander, in the interest of the unity of his world empire, demanded worship as a divinity from all his subjects. There is no indication to point to his having issued this request to the Asiatics as well. The request is attested in the case of the Greeks, and, as we may assume, only in the case of the Greeks of the Corinthian League. This makes it clear also that his request was not addressed to the Macedonians, for Macedonia was outside the League. The idea of a general official cult for the empire was quite alien to Alexander, though his successors after his death put his portrait on coins instead of the types of the gods. Equally erroneous is the conception, formerly widespread but held by some people even today, that the idea of apotheosis was Oriental, and this is why they see in the act a sign of the king's growing Orientalism. We may here exclude from consideration the unique divine kingship of Egypt, the effect of which, even on Alexander, was, as we saw, quite local in its limitations. In the 3rd millennium, a worship of the ruler as divine had been developed along with the notion of world empire in Mesopotamia. But from Hammurabi, about 2000, onwards it had disappeared, and thus this is the important point. The Achaemenids had never been worshipped as gods by their subjects. In Alexander's day, the idea was quite unknown to the Asiatic East and cannot have been borrowed thence. Modern scholarship has recognized that it is rather a purely Greek idea, which was called into life again by Alexander. With the Greeks, the dividing line between gods and men, as their legends and myths bear out, had always been fluid. As Heracles had earned a place among the Olympians by his deeds, so in the bright light of history, the mortal, who had performed superhuman tasks in the eyes of his contemporaries, had in his lifetime been the recipient of divine honors. Lysander, for instance, when he was at the summit of his power, had been worshipped as a god, with altars and paeans by the Samian oligarchs. Clearchus, tyrant of Heraclea, a pupil of Isocrates, had caused himself to be worshipped by his subjects as son of Zeus. Moreover, Philip's partisans at Ephesus had set up his statue in the temple of Artemis, and had thus paid him divine honors. When Philip himself at the marriage feast of Agaea, 336, had his own image carried in a procession as the 13th, along with the 12 chief gods of Macedonia, which made him appear, if not a god, at least as enthroned with the gods. One may conjecture in this the influence of Greek ideas upon the Macedonian court. Nor was it only practice that gave Alexander precedent. Theory also played its part. His teacher Aristotle said in his Politics that if there was a man who in ability and political capacity is incomparably superior to all others, such a man is as a god among men. And added that against such there is no law, for they are a law to themselves. And had not Isocrates written to his father Philip in his latest letter that, if he forced the great king to submission, nothing remained for him but to become a god? Had not Alexander now accomplished infinitely more than Philip? It was in harmony with purely Greek ideas that after his victorious return from India he claimed divine honors from the Greeks. The idea was all the more familiar to him because 7 years before, the priest of Ammon had greeted him as son of Zeus. If then he had not committed himself to proclaiming officially in the Greek world this divine sonship, the announcement of which he had accepted with faith, in the sense of the Greek conception, as a divine revelation and a recognition of his superhuman divine force. Yet this consciousness of a divine sonship had always remained in his mind, possessed by it, elevated by his fabulous success and expectation of his plans for world sovereignty. He now took the decisive step of going further than these special revelations, and of requiring divine honors from the Greeks of the Corinthian League. It is a mistaken view of Alexander's character to bar out this inner religious experience and to assume that the demand was a purely political move, the only object of which was to lift him as a god above the stipulations of the Corinthian League, and to subject the autonomous Greek cities and their lands to his divine will. Certainly, his apotheosis, if accepted, meant a great increase of his personal prestige with the cities of the League, a consummation which could not but be desirable to him. And on the theory of Aristotle, his will would have been raised above the laws. But on the one hand, Alexander had already, as we saw, previously set himself above the provisions of the League Treaty, without needing a divine authority, merely on the ground of his growing predominance, and he could continue to do the same. On the other hand, the Greeks, though they admitted the apotheosis, did not on that account recognize his will as divine law, but, at any rate in the case of the Athenians, refused him obedience and were determined to resist him to the uttermost, even by violence. In the practice of political life, they made a distinction between the god whom they worshipped with a cult and the earthly Hegemon, whose rights and duties were fixed in their eyes afterwards as before by the covenant of the League. It must be mentioned that even later, the Hellenistic cults of kings, though as imperial cult, it meant more in the several Greek states than Alexander's apotheosis, was never an obstacle to disobedience, and had no influence whatever on the practice of political life. This distinction between the political and religious spheres, along with the Greek character of the apotheosis, explains to us the fact that the Greeks complied with Alexander's wish without serious scruples. Naturally, the members of the anti-Macedonian factions argued against it, but if those political consequences had really been bound up with the apotheosis, the opposition would have been of a different kind, and the speeches in the popular assemblies would not have been as harmless or as ironical in their tone as those that have been handed down to us, nor would a champion of freedom like Demosthenes, after an original protest, have finally advised the Athenian people to recognize the king as son of Zeus, or as Poseidon too, if he wished. The indifference, which treated the question almost as a bagatelle, demonstrates that it was a question not of high politics, but of religion, which, in the opinion of the Illuminati, to whom the old polytheism was no longer possessed of any meaning, had no exciting importance. We are ill-informed how the affair was managed. That the initiative proceeded from Alexander is certain, but we do not hear in what shape it reached the Greeks. It can scarcely have been a command, but more probably a desire which he either expressed or caused to be expressed to the Sanhedrion, and which, however formulated, was indubitably equivalent to a demand. The Sanhedrion may then have communicated the desire to the several members of the League, for actually no uniform League cult was created, but the individual states by popular decree received the king among the gods of their community. What form they chose, whether as god or as son of a god, see Demosthenes, was obviously entirely left to them. The prevailing assumption that at Athens, on the proposal of Demades, Alexander received his cult as the new Dionysus, has recently been proved erroneous. In the spring of the next year, in 323, ambassadors from Hellas reached Alexander at Babylon to honor him with golden crowns. They appeared not as envoys to an earthly king, but with wreaths on their heads as festal ambassadors, therori, who come to a god. As Arrian states, Hellas had complied with his desire. The effort to rearrange affairs in Greece called forth as well new orders of Alexander, issued from Susa in the spring of 324. This time they were commands, and he sent them to the Sanhedrion by Nicanor of Stagira, the one which concerned the local leagues of the Achaeans, Arcadians, and Boeotians, is obscure to us, because we have it only in a mutilated form. The other edict was very important. By it, Alexander ordered that in the territory of the League all exiles, with the exception of temple robbers and murderers, usually omitted from amnesties, should return to their homes and be entirely or partially reinstated in their previous properties. The sanction was added that in case any city refused to receive its exiles back ante parter, the representatives of Alexander was to compel them by force. Politically, one must regard this decree as an act of wise statesmanship. Alexander attacked one of the worst cancers of the Greek system of small states and endeavored to remove it, and one will esteem the decree all the more highly, because under existing political conditions, many of the exiles to be restored must have been his political opponents, whom he might have hoped to reconcile by this act. On the other hand, it is obvious that this order, issued by Alexander alone, without any cooperation of the Sanhedrion, was a glaring violation of the covenant of the League. Though the paragraph in question is not preserved to us, yet according to the spirit of the covenant, it cannot be doubtful that an arrangement like this could only be made by the cooperation of Hegemon and Sanhedrion. We may emphasize the fact that in the tedious discussions of this edict, no trace is anywhere to be found of any reference to the religious importance that Alexander obtained by apotheosis in the League cities. This last stage of the way to the ignoring of the Sanhedrion and the forming of an autocratic position is rather to be explained exclusively by Alexander's vastly increased consciousness of power. The decree is not a result of the claim to apotheosis, which, as we have shown, had no political object. On the contrary, both have their roots in the same psychological fact. In the decree speaks the man who was aiming at world sovereignty and was determined to shake off the inconvenient fetters of the covenant of the League. To the Sanhedrion, to which Nicanor handed the original edict, fell merely, it appears, the task of communicating copies of it to all the members of the League. In this last stage of his development, Alexander used the Sanhedrion simply as the place of publication for the expression of his absolute and omnipotent will. It was probably under the impression of the news thus heard from Susa, the mass marriages with Persian women, and this edict, that Aristotle sent to Alexander the well-known warning to treat the Hellenes as a hegemon and the barbarians as a despot. Teacher and pupil could no longer understand each other. Among the exiles, this decree naturally evoked the greatest enthusiasm. When Nicanor, at the Olympic Games of 324, in the festival assembly, to which the exiles had collected at the news of what was impending, caused a letter of Alexander to be read by the herald, in which the king communicated to the exiles the contents of his edict. There was a loud shout of joy in the Altis. It may be an exaggeration to put the number of the exiles who had gathered together as high as 20,000. Yet the numbers gives us an approximate conception of the extent of the revolutions in political life, and the tenure of property in the Greek states that must have been brought about by the execution of the edict. How difficult the process was is shown by an inscription from Tegea. It is conceivable, therefore, that when Nicanor appeared in Hellas with this edict in the spring of 324, and the object of his mission became notorious, great excitement and unrest seized the cities. Athens was hardest hit. It had to return to the Samian exiles the island of Samos, which it had occupied a generation before and distributed among Athenian clerics. The Aetolians, too, became relative, for they had to receive exiles into the Acarnanian town of Onanadai, which they had occupied. It was consequently into an atmosphere of great tension that Harpalas arrived, the unfaithful treasurer of Alexander, who, as we saw, had run away with his stolen treasures, and, to save himself, speculated on raising Athens to revolt against Alexander by means of his ill-gotten gains. Since previously he had supported Athens with grain, on the occasions of great scarcity which befell Hellas between 330 and 326, and in reward had been granted Attic citizenship, he now hoped to be admitted into the Piraeus. By the advice of Demosthenes, he was denied entrance, and a correct attitude was adopted. But when he had left at Tanerum, his army and fleet and the bulk of his treasure, and came again with only 2 triremes, craving admission as a suppliant, he was admitted into the Piraeus by Philocles, Strategos for 325-4, and consequently before the change of officials in 324. The question, what was to be done with Harpalas, was all the more delicate, for messengers had already appeared in Athens demanding his surrender, sent by Philoxenus, Alexander's director of finance for Asia Minor. As no direct commands from Alexander had arrived, it was possible to adopt the expedient suggested by Demosthenes of arresting him for the time being and depositing his stolen monies on the Acropolis for Alexander. After an interval, however, Harpalas escaped from Athens, and the people received with surprise the information that only half the money he had brought with him, which by his statement amounted to 700 talents, had been deposited on the Acropolis. What had become of the other half? It is significant of the low moral standard of political life at Athens, that it was assumed as a matter of course that the missing sum had been employed by Harpalas in the bribery of leading politicians. Then began the notorious Harpalas trial, which vividly exhibits the absolute rottenness of Attic democracy at the time. It is not the place here to relate in detail how the investigation of the case was committed to the Areopagus on the proposal of Demosthenes, how the Areopagus, early in 323, after 6 months' delay, published a report on the guilty persons with the amount of the bribes they had taken, and how the popular tribunal inflicted heavy fines on those whom the Areopagus had declared guilty. Among the condemned, who belonged to different political parties, was Demosthenes, who, as he could not pay the fine of 50 talents, was imprisoned, but soon afterwards escaped to Troezen. This affair of Harpalas, in which it was a question of moneys, which, though Alexander's property had disappeared into the pockets of political leaders at Athens, was not exactly calculated to improve the relations between Athens and the king, which had already been severely strained by the decree concerning the exiles. On the contrary, Athens was deeply compromised in the eyes of Alexander. The tension grew into an increasing opposition to him, as the people were determined not to obey the royal command concerning the surrender of Samos. Alexander did not intend to give way, and soon wild rumors circulated about an impending collision in arms. That such thoughts were also expressed by the retinue of Alexander is revealed by the statement that at a great feast in Ecbatana in the autumn of 324, a certain Gorgas of Iasus, one of Alexander's bodyguard, known to us by documents as a patron of the Samians, had proclamation made by a herald that should Alexander besiege Athens, he would present to him 10,000 equipments and as many catapults and all other artillery in sufficient quantity. In spite of this heated state of feeling, the contemporary negotiations about the apotheosis of Alexander led to the acceptance of the demand. As we saw, this question was not conceived as a political one, and the Athenians, like the rest of the Greeks, felt themselves in no way bound by their recognition of Alexander's divinity to obey his earthly commands. Perhaps by this concession, they thought to make him more inclined to yield on the greater political question. In the beginning of the summer of 324, Alexander had left Susa to visit Ecbatana, the splendid Median capital of the Achaemenids. He dispatched the major part of the army to the Tigris under Hephaestion, while he himself, with the Hypaspes and some chosen corps, used the opportunity to sail down the Euxine into the Persian Gulf with Nearchus's fleet. Since his return to Persepolis, the longing had seized him to sail on the Persian Gulf, as previously on the Indian Ocean, and to make himself acquainted with the mouths of the Tigris and the Euphrates. When he had satisfied the longing, he went back up the Tigris and rejoined Hephaestion. After removing, in his progress, the dams constructed by the Persians to foil attacks from the sea, he came with his army to Opis. Here, at the nearest point to Babylon in the line of communication with the west, he wanted to dismiss his veterans to their homes. This led to a terrible scene, when Alexander made known to the assembly of the Macedonian army his well-meant decision to send home with rich presents those veterans who from age or wounds were no longer fit to fight. There was an outburst of anger against the king for his attitude to Persians and Persian ways, and especially against the military reforms at Susa, which seemed to indicate a preference for the Persians, and so annoyed them most deeply. Behind his resolution, they suspiciously scented the intention of separating himself altogether from the Macedonians as people unfit for war, and so in open mutiny the assembly shouted at him that they would all go home, and scornfully added he might take the field with his father. From this allusion to Ammon, one must not conclude that Alexander had in any way demanded of the Macedonians recognition of his sonship to Ammon, just because the idea of divine sonship was something quite foreign to them. They mistook its real meaning, and saw in it merely a reflection on their revered King Philip. Now, in a moment of mad passion, it was their one object to wound the king personally as deeply as possible. In that they succeed. Scarcely had Alexander heard these words, with which the most sacred experience of his inner life was publicly ridiculed, when he jumped down from the tribune with his officers among the mutineers, caused the Hypaspists to arrest the ringleaders, 13 in number, whom he pointed out with his hand, and led them off to execution. He was now master of the situation. Silence fell on the tumultuous assembly, and no one dared to say a word. Amid a complete hush, Alexander ascended to the tribune, in tacit rejection of the distorted view of his relation to his divine father, which had been expressed in that scornful cry. He began his speech with an acknowledgment of his earthly father, whom, as a matter of fact, he had never disowned. With burning words, he reproached the soldiers for their ingratitude, and recalled to them how much they owed to his father Philip, who found them at the beginning of his reign, wretched herdsmen, dressed in sheepskins and feeding their cattle on the mountains, and made them the ruling people in Greece. Then he reminded them of all he himself had done for them. Now he had made them lords of the East, and with them shared all dangers and fatigues. But he would not detain them. They should all return to Macedonia and tell the people there that they had left their king to the protection of the vanquished barbarians. With the word of command, "Dismiss," he jumped down from the tribune and shut himself up in the royal castle, refusing to see anyone. Nor could anyone get speech with him the next day. The Macedonians were at their wits' end. They had not seriously intended what they had cried out in the heat of passion, that they would all leave him. But he had taken them at their word. They were all dismissed, and felt the disgrace deeply. What were they to do? On the third day, Alexander sent for the noble Persians, and distributed among them appointments in the army, and gave the non-Macedonian formations, especially the Epigonai, the proud names Persian Agama, Persian Pahazaratoi, and so on. Moreover, he appointed several of the Persian nobles as his kinsmen, who, alone by Persian custom, had the right to salute the king with a kiss. When the Macedonians heard of this countermeasure, their last resistance was broken. They rushed the castle, threw their arms down before the gate, cried out and begged for pardon. Then Alexander came out of the gate, and when he saw his old comrades in arms repentant before him, his anger was dissipated, and tears burst from his eyes, when emotion made him speechless, and an old Macedonian officer stepped up and respectfully said to him that the appointment of Persians as kinsmen gave them especial pain. He cried out, "I make you all my kinsmen," and the old Macedonian was the first to be allowed to kiss him. Thus peace was restored between the king and his Macedonians. Alexander had won a complete victory by the overpowering forcefulness of his nature. He had brought the mutinous troops back to obedience, and even attached them more closely to himself, without making any concession. But there was still lacking the reconciliation between Macedonians and Persians, which in the interest of his empire was the darling wish of his heart. With this in view, he now instituted a great feast of reconciliation. At the table the Macedonians sat next to the king. After them, the Persians and some leading men of other nationalities. In all, we are told, 9,000 persons. The feast began with the libations, which Alexander and his guest poured to the gods out of the same mixing bowl, the conduct of the ceremony being in the hands of Greek soothsayers and Persian magians. In the sacrificial prayers, Alexander uttered the wish that besides all other good things concord and partnership in rule might be granted to Macedonians and Persians. He could not have revealed his political aims more clearly. The two nations, conquerors and conquered, were to live in harmony with one another and rule conjointly. In this he saw the strongest possible prop for the future of his Asiatic empire. This alone is the natural reference of the words, nor were the different religions of the two nations to be any obstacle to their political and cultural amalgamation. And so, as if to set the pattern, he caused Greek soothsayers and Persian magians to function side by side. This moment is a very great one in the life of Alexander. Thoughts which had long occupied him suddenly came to the light of day, clearly defined. Recently, however, out of this prayer of Opus has been read a confession of the brotherhood of humanity, and through Stoic doctrine it has been connected with Christianity. These ideas ascribed to Alexander were quite strange to him. The actual prayer makes it most plain that the ideal, which was before him, was simply the fraternization of Macedonians and Persians. There is no trace whatever of Alexander's treating all mankind as one brotherhood. The festivals were followed by the dismissal, as previously designed by Alexander, of about 10,000 veterans. The consequence was that the old Macedonian elements in the army who were most hostile to his new idea were lessened, and this must have been welcome to him. To each man on discharge, he gave not only his pay up to his arrival home, but a talent besides. He retained the children whom Asiatic wives had borne to them, in order to prevent family dissensions at home, and promised to educate them in Macedonian fashion, to train them as soldiers, and later, when young men, himself to take them to their fathers in Macedonia. He committed to Craterus, who stood next to him after Hephaestion, and was very popular with the Macedonians, the task of leading the veterans back. Craterus was also ordered to replace Antipater as imperial viceroy in Europe, while Antipater was to come out to the camp with fresh troops. The reason for this exchange was partly because the relations between Antipater and the Imperius Olympius had constantly led to quarrels and complaints on both sides, which were painful to Alexander as a son. There was the further reason that the policy of Antipater towards Hellas, on account of its oligarchic coloring, did not harmonize with Alexander's views. And so, Craterus, the new viceroy, was instructed to see to the freedom of the Greeks, a phrase which doubtless refers to the clauses about freedom in the Covenant of the League. Thus, while the decree about the exiles was causing commotion in Greece, Alexander as Hegemon took his stand on the maintenance of the covenant. From Opus Alexander, his army went over Mount Zagros to Akbatana. The authorities tell us nothing about any measure of government taken during this residence of several months in the Median capital, compared with the feverish activity which Alexander manifested immediately after his arrival at Babylon in the spring of 323. These months at Akbatana are like the calm before storm. Certainly his program of action was fixed and ready when he appeared at Babylon. We may therefore assume that his future plans took definite shape at Ekbatana at the latest, and, as was always the case before new undertakings, were carefully worked out, if indeed he did not begin them in the equally long and quiet stay at Susa. What was the nature of these plans? With his return to Susa, Alexander could regard the conquest of Asia as essentially complete. Though certain regions in northern Asia Minor had not yet been subjugated, his Indian campaign showed us that he could not remain content with the occupation of the Achaemenid Empire, but was impelled, not merely by the desire of conquest, but also by the joy of scientific discovery, to reach out beyond its limits, to the furthest confines of the inhabited world. Though he was obliged to stop at the Hephaestus, and was unable to reach his goal, the ocean, yet the voyage down the Indus had led him into the Indian Ocean, and had caused him to establish by means of Narkas the connection between the delta of the Indus and the mouths of the Euphrates and the Tigris, thereby fixing the southern limit of Asia. This result was now to be exploited for the trade of the empire by the settlement of these coasts, especially those of the Persian Gulf, a notion which had been before his mind already, as the instructions to Nearchus showed. But new problems had in the meantime come up in Alexander's restless brain. The opposite coast of Arabia was still unexplored, and the shape of the country unknown. Might it not be possible to find a way around Arabia to Egypt, and institute a connection by sea between Babylon and Alexandria? Magnificent prospects for the intercommunication and commerce of the empire opened before him. Great advances were to be expected in the geographical views of the ocean and of the world. Immediately after returning to Babylon, Alexander ordered an expedition to circumnavigate Arabia. The limits of the Achaemenid Empire were again to be transcended. At that time he was much absorbed by oceanographical problems, as we may observe from his intense interest in the old problem of the Caspian Sea, which had occupied him when he stayed on the southern shore. He was seized by the longing. Run the words again. He sent a certain Heracles with orders to build ships there, sail across the Caspian, and so establish whether it was really an inland sea, as Aristotle had taught him, and not rather a bay of the ocean, as the old Ionians had assumed, and as had appeared debatable to him himself after the discovery of the Indian Ocean. At the same time, it is possible that considerations of commercial policy may have contributed to the mission. Owing to Alexander's death, neither this undertaking nor the Arabian expedition was carried out. These are the expeditions which Alexander actually set on foot in the few months of life yet granted him. Scarcely was he dead, then there were found in the royal archives memoranda which disclosed that the Arabian expedition was only the prelude to still vaster plans. These official memoranda, hypomemata, contain probably the working out and calculations as to the technical accomplishment of his last plans, and the military and financial resources required for them. We possess only a brief table of contents, from which it appears that 1,000 warships of larger than triremes were to be built in Phoenicia, Syria, Cilicia, and Cyprus for a campaign against the Carthaginians and the other coast people who lived in Africa, Spain, and the coast adjoining up to Sicily. It is mentioned also that the road was to be made along the African coast to the Pillars of Heracles, and that in correspondence with the requirement of so great a naval enterprise, harbors and docks were to be constructed at suitable places. These accounts of the Hypomemata indicate nothing less than that Alexander, after becoming Lord of Asia, actually thought of a conquest of the whole world. He is probably the only man in history who conceived the gigantic plan of becoming world ruler in the proper sense of the word. His empire now reached westwards, in the north to the Adriatic, in the south to Cyrene, which was a friendly ally. In these last plans, it was a question of winning the coast of the western Mediterranean. Obviously, the first stroke was to be aimed at Carthage, which was then the most important naval and commercial power in the west. whether he would have succeeded in carrying out his plans is a question, the answer to which is beyond the competence of the historian. But one can scarcely deny the possibility in the case of Alexander, who accomplished so much that was apparently impossible. Another question is whether he would have succeeded in forming out of the then known world an empire which would have had any prospect of continuance. The question is probably to be answered in the negative. Created simply by his unique personality, this empire would have lost its vitality with his death. That later on the Roman world empire maintained itself vigorously for centuries is no argument to the contrary. In this case, for generation on generation, stone was laid on stone, till the colossal building stood firmly compacted, borne by the iron will to power of a strong nation. Alexander, on the other hand, would have at most created an ephemeral episode, since for such ideas he had neither the Macedonians nor the Greeks behind him. He stood quite alone. We should assume a priori, on the analogy of the careful preliminary preparation of Alexander other enterprises, that in these plans he was not indulging merely in baseless fancies, but had endeavored beforehand, as much as possible, to obtain information about the strength of the various states of the West, and their political relation to one another. We happen to know that, when he was in the Far East, he sent for the Sicilian history of the expert Philistus, the statesman of Dionysius I, through which he could certainly obtain a deep insight in the wars of the Western Greeks, with the Carthaginians and their Italian neighbors, and another thing gave him a personal interest in the problem of the Western Greeks, and to some extent information about them. His brother-in-law, Alexander the Molossian, at the time when he himself crossed into Asia, entered the service of the Tarentines to fight for them against the Lusanians and Bruttians of Lower Italy, and lost his life in the war. Certainly nothing now was further from Alexander's thoughts than a pan-Hellenic policy like that of his early years, but it is more than possible that in a conquest of the West it would have been his concern to rescue the Greek element there, and to make Greek culture dominant in the region of the Western Mediterranean, that he had actually begun already to think and work out the necessary military preparations for this campaign is evident in the scanty extracts from the Appendix, together with his notes on the building of a fleet and the construction of a road in stages. Some modern writers have rejected as a later legend these notes from the Appendix, but the notes go back to a first-class source, Shahnameh of Cardia, and we have no right to strike them out of Alexander's history. Psychologically, it is quite intelligible that he should have formed these plans of ruling the world. In 10 years he had subjected all Asia up to India. No nation and no fortress had been able to resist him. He was a young man of 32, and humanly speaking, could count on a long life. Did it correspond to his perpetual delight in the onset of battle, and his constant longing for the limits of the world, now to lay aside the sword and devote the rest of his life to building up peacefully what he had won? That would be a new Alexander, and would have little in common with the historical figure. We have no right to reject this well-attested and credible statement of the Appendix. Without these latest plans of world conquest, we should draw an incomplete and incorrect picture of Alexander. We may take it that he kept these plans secret, and only discussed and worked them out in a narrow circle of intimates. These were very few who were ready to follow him on these dizzy paths. The only man in his suite who completely understood him was the friend of his youth, Hephaestion. All the more terrible was his loss, when at Atbatana, during an orgiastic festival of Dionysus, this friend was carried off by a fatal fever. In passionate sorrow, Alexander gave himself up to the mourning. For 3 days he lay by his friend's corpse without taking food or drink. Achilles mourned for his Patroclus. Many stories circulated afterwards regarding the forms in which his pain expressed itself. How much is true? It is difficult to decide. it is certain that he wished at once to see his dead friend elevated to the divine sphere. He sent messengers to the oasis of Siwa to ask his father Amon whether he might sacrifice to Hephaestion as hero or as god. He ordered Perdiccas to take the corpse to Babylon, where a monument of unheard of magnificence and costliness was to be erected to him. To immortalize the name of the deceased in the army, the hierarchy of the Heteroi, which he had commanded as Kailarch, was called Hephaestion's Chelarchy. On the other hand, the office of Grand Vizier, which Hephaestion had held with the title of Chelarch, was not filled at all. The place next to the king remained empty. At last, Alexander roused himself from mourning and began the march back to Babylon. On the way he took the field against the Koseans, a warlike and predatory tribe at Mount Zagros, who, relying on their lurking places in the lofty mountains, had maintained their independence of the great kings. Being now attacked in winter, they could not retire to their snow-covered mountain heights, but had to oppose Alexander in the valleys. In 40 days, their subjection was completed. As he continued his march to Babylon, he was met on the way by embassies from the most different peoples of the earth, ready to do homage to the new lord of the East. From Africa came Libyans and possibly Ethiopians, and above all, Carthaginians. From Italy came Lucanians and Bruttians, Etruscans and Romans. From the far west, perhaps also Iberians and Celts. The sending of these embassies was an echo of the news that he had returned as victor from India. By the variety of these envoys, we get an idea of the deep impression made on the peoples of the West by the erection of the powerful empire of Alexander, and of the majesty with which his personality was surrounded in the eyes of the whole world. Though these people certainly knew nothing yet of those latest plans of world conquest, nevertheless, from the Carthaginians at least, who had already suffered a severe loss of prestige in the conquest of Tyre, their metropolis, and in the foundation of Egyptian Alexander, the fear was not distant that Alexander, who by alliance with Cyrene had advanced to their flank, would one day threaten their land or damage it by his trade policy. At any rate, by the union of the whole East in the hand of one who had never been conquered, a new factor of power was created, which was bound to put the politicians of the West on their guard. All the more so, the less they could, for the moment, see through Alexander's future plans, and to make them endeavor to cultivate good relations with his new power. Apart from the general situation, special occasions for the sending of embassies may be conjectured for the Italian peoples, for the Lucanians and Bruttians, on account of their war with Alexander's brother-in-law, Alexander the Molossian, and for the Etruscans, before their piracies which had endangered members of the Corinthian League. As to the Romans, it is in itself not easy to believe that then, in the middle of the Samnite War, they sent an embassy to Babylon, yet one will not, like the ex-consul of Rome, Arrian, reject this statement, when one hears from another source that Alexander had once already sent a severe reprimand to the Romans on account of the share of the Antiotes in the piracies of the Etruscans. If one reflects that Alexander, when he received all these envoys, was already secretly planning a war of conquest against the West, one can imagine with what keen interest he will have regarded these people and talked to them, in order, if possible, to get more exact information about their countries. When he crossed the Tigris to approach Babylon, he was encountered by envoys of the Chaldeans, who warned him against entering Babylon, for according to an oracle given by Marduk, this would be bad for him. Alexander had some reason to scent behind this a lie of the crafty priests. He had learned that they had only carelessly obeyed and soon ignored the command which he had given them in 331, to rebuild the temple of Marduk destroyed by Xerxes, because by the completion of the work they would lose the rich temple revenues, which now flowed into their pockets. He therefore rejected their warning, but when they begged him at least to enter the city from the west and not from the east, he was willing to meet them in this, but soon saw that the marshes in the west made this impossible, so in spite of the warnings of the priests, he entered the city from the east. Naturally, the oracle was regarded as fulfilled in his death soon afterwards. The first thing he did in Babylon was to throw himself with fiery zeal into the preparation of his Arabian expedition. He did not intend a conquest of the Arabian mainland, but at most some spots on the coast or adjacent islands, which offered good harbors or were suitable for stations, were to be occupied in order to serve as support for the future voyages of trading ships. The grand objective was the circumnavigation of Arabia, the discovery of the way into the Red Sea and up to Heronopolis, near Suez, and the establishment of a connection by sea between Babylon and Alexandria. For this expedition, a fleet had to be collected at Babylon, the ocean fleet of Nearchus, which had sailed up the Euphrates to Babylon, awaited the king there, and was to be increased by ships built with the cypresses of Babylonia. Orders, too, were given for warships to be built in the reliable dockyards of the Phoenician cities, divided into sections. They were to be transported overland, the Thapascus, but together again there, and brought down the Euphrates to Babylon. At the same time, Alexander caused a beginning to be made with the excavation of a great harbor at Babylon, so big that it could hold, Arrian says, 1,000 warships with their ship houses. This is only a figure, which does not warrant the conclusion that Alexander then or later wanted to collect 1,000 warships there. The gigantic harbor was rather intended not only for the Asiatic war fleet, which was much smaller, but as a station for merchant ships as well. In the future, Alexander counted on a great development of trade by sea between India, the Persian Gulf, and Egypt, and Babylon was to be the chief place of exchange for this eastern trade. In general, Babylon, in accordance with its ancient tradition, was made by Alexander once more the center of the Asiatic world. The prevailing view that he made Babylon the permanent capital of his whole empire is erroneous. That is true only of his Asiatic empire. If his western plans materialized, he could not rule his world empire from Babylon. By its position, Alexandria and Egypt was excellently adapted for the purpose, at least as capital for the western part of his world empire. In the first instance, before the voyage with the fleet began, the coast of Arabia had to be explored as far as possible. Alexander had previously dispatched in a 30-oared vessel Archias of Pella, who had already approved himself in a high position during Nearchus's voyage. But Archias did not venture further than the island of Tylos, Bahrain, in the Persian Gulf, after he had given in his report. Androsthenes of Thassos was dispatched with the same object in a like craft. He also does not seem to have got beyond Tylos, but he brought back valuable observations on the flora of the island, as by his description it has been calculated that he saw it in winter, December to January. It follows that these voyages of exploration were ordered from Ecbatana 324-5, the third to be sent by Hieron of Soloi, who received positive orders to go round Arabia to Heronopolis. He got at least as far as the promontory of Maketa, which Nearchus had seen from Ormuz, but when he saw how endlessly far the coast stretched beyond that promontory, he returned and announced to Alexander that Arabia was astonishingly large, not much smaller than India. As barren of result was the synchronous expedition Anaxartes, whom Alexander ordered to take the reverse direction and go from Heronopolis round Arabia into the Persian Gulf. He passed through the Strait of Bab el-Mandeb, but returned for lack of water. All these accounts show that Alexander and his contemporaries had no idea of the shape and size of Arabia. But they also show how passionately, in spite of these failures, he pressed forward the preparations for his great sea expedition. He caused the fleet to carry out maneuvers on the Euphrates, and offered wreaths as prizes for the best rowers and steersmen. This time he himself intended to accompany the fleet, which not only shows his personal interest in this voyage of discovery, but perhaps permits the inference that he meant by this route to appear again in the Mediterranean at Alexandria. and then to address himself to his great plans for the West. Meanwhile, he also took steps to put in hand his plan of settlement of the north coast of the Persian Gulf. From the reports of Narkas, he had become convinced that by regular settlements of the coast and adjacent islands, a second Phoenicia could be created. He now sent Michaelis of Clazomenae with 500 talents to Phoenicia and Syria in order to enlist suitable people there out of the seafaring population, and also to buy slaves who might be settled in those parts. To promote these eastern trade, on the gulf between the mouths of the Euleus and Tigris and Alexandria Carax was founded, perhaps in 324 when he visited this region, a town which was suited by its position to become the chief export harbor for Babylon. While, to promote the navigation, he had already in 324 removed the Persian dams on the Tigris. Above all, Alexander was anxious to enhance the prosperity of the whole of Babylonia by an improved regulation of the network of canals that had been always, since the days of Hammurabi, the chief task prescribed by nature to the rulers of Babylon, a task which today once more is occupying modern engineering, so to regulate the annual inundations of the Euphrates and Tigris by canals and dikes, that they might become a blessing instead of a curse to the land. With complete understanding of what was required, Alexander devoted himself to the work in person. From Babylon, he undertook a voyage of inspection through the canal area, and examined and repaired the bunds on the canal of Palakotas, which was intended to win a great part of the desert for cultivation. He also traveled on this canal into the lakes bounding the Arabian desert, and, probably for protection against Bedouin Arabs, founded in Alexandria, in which he settled Greek mercenaries, volunteers, and veterans. When he returned from this voyage to Babylon, he found Piaketas, the satrap of Persis, there, who had brought 20,000 Persians trained for the army, Kosaeans, Taparians, and other efficient troops from the neighboring peoples. From Caria and Lydia, too, came new troops, as well as reinforcements of cavalry from Macedonia. The arrival of these new military units, especially of the 20,000 Persians, caused Alexander again to undertake a reorganization of the army. It was the last he executed, or at least began. Instead of placing Macedonian and Persian units side by side, the arrangement introduced at Opis, rather in the heat of conflict than after calm consideration. He resolved on bringing about in the military units a real amalgamation of the two peoples, which would correspond most nearly with his political intentions. This meant the complete abandonment of the old Macedonian phalanx. For each of its smallest units, the Decades, was in future to consist of 4 Macedonians, armed in Macedonian fashion, and 12 Persians, who were armed either with bows or javelins. The command being entrusted to a Macedonian, apart from the close connection of the two peoples, it was an attempt at an organic combination of different arms within the same cadre. In judging this peculiar experiment, we must not, as is usually done, overlook the fact that it was certainly intended solely for the Asiatic Empire, since it can be explained only by Alexander's Asiatic policy. In Macedonia, of course, the old phalanx was to continue in being. The death of Alexander soon afterwards prevented the complete execution of this novel idea. This Macedonian-Persian army never came into action. After Alexander's death, the whole policy of amalgamation was abandoned, and its military product with it. At any rate, we may be sure that if this new army failed to prove itself in practice, Alexander would not have hesitated to replace it by another organization, just as he removed the Persian satraps when they did not approve themselves. This spring, many embassies from Greece reached Babylon. They had been sent there with the most varied petitions. Many of them approached the king with golden crowns, themselves garlanded, like Theoroi, who came to honor a god, and thus testified that their native city had introduced his apotheosis. Those ambassadors who had to make up representations against the decree for the recall of the exiles had to return home unsuccessful. Alexander never dreamed of concession. About May, his envoys returned from the oasis of Siwa and announced that Amon had declared that Hephaestion should be reverenced as a hero. Though the idea of a divine cult was thereby rejected, Alexander was highly delighted that the oracle sanctioned the middle course, and forthwith gave orders that Hephaestion should receive heroic honors. In particular, he sent orders to Cleomenes of Narcratis to erect 2 heroia of great size and extraordinary splendor to Hephaestion in Alexandria, one in the city itself, the other on the island of Pharos. This was so near to his heart that we are told he promised to Cleomenes a general pardon for all past and future official lapses, if he did justice to the commission. But the death of the king soon after stopped its execution. Ptolemy, the new satrap, to whom Cleomenes was subordinate, had no idea of erecting the heroia. That Alexander intended these monuments to be erected in Egyptian Alexandria is another indication that, according to his plans at the time, this city was to play a special part in his world empire. After the arrival of the message from Amon, the actual funeral of Hephaestion took place at Babylon. With this, the general mourning, ordered by Alexander for the whole country, came to an end. Hephaestion was no longer the dead man, but the hero, and Alexander was the first to offer to him the sacrifice appropriate to a hero, anagasma. A very difficult problem is raised by the great monument which, after Hephaestion's death, Alexander ordered in his honor at Babylon. The description Diodorus gives us of it sounds quite fantastic, and yet it might be based on the actual design. The work was entrusted to the architect Dionocrates, who had drawn the plans for Egyptian Alexandria. On a surface 1 stadion square, the monument was to rise to a height of over 130 cubits, in 5 stories, becoming smaller as they rose higher. The outer walls of these stories were to be decorated with unheard of magnificence. On the lowest exterior were to be placed 240 gilded beaks of Panteris, quinqueremes, the largest type of vessel, and of their herasons were to be set kneeling archers and other figures of 4 to 5 cubits in height. On the second story, gigantic torches, 15 cubits high, were to be fastened, decorated with golden crowns and eagles flying upwards, to which snakes looked up from below. Round the third story was to run a hunting scene. Round the fourth, a gilded Santaramaki. Round the fifth, lions and bulls alternatively. Above that structure was to be finished off with Macedonian and barbarian weapons, certainly not, as Diodorus thinks, so to signify victory and defeat, but to symbolize the amalgamation of the Macedonians and Persians in one army, which the king was then trying to carry out, for no doubt the barbarian weapons were Persian. At the apex of the whole were to stand gigantic sirens, hollow inside to contain the singers, who, themselves unseen, were to sing their songs from within. The expenses of this fabulously wonderful structure were calculated at 10 to 12,000 talents. It is very interesting to see how in this last artistic design of Alexander's epoch, the ideas of Greek and of Oriental art were blended, that the Babylonian ziggurats, though not stepped buildings like this, but inclined planes, influenced the shape of this structure, is beyond all doubt. As most of our authorities, including Arrian, call this building a pyre, it is generally assumed that it was burned together with the corpse of Hephaestion. This cannot, however, be correct, nor is it stated by Diodorus, to whom we owe the above description. In reality, the building, as we learn from the above-mentioned Hapabamata, was still unfinished when Alexander died. How could it be conceivable that the gigantic structure, with its wealth of varied works of art, could be made in the few months between the deaths of Hephaestion and Alexander? It was never completed. By order of the assembly of the army, it was stopped forever after Alexander's death. The authorities, Justine and Plutarch, who called this monument not a pyre, but a tomb, tumulus timbos, are probably right. Alexander's idea was to found a stately heroon to his favorite friend, which in size and costliness was to be a worthy peer of the colossal building of Babylon, and in the heart of Asia was to proclaim forever the fame of Hephaestion. As the Heroa of Alexandria would do to the Western world, and the ornamentation of the exterior, it is tempting to look for a special reference to Hephaestion's relation to Alexander. In the hunting scene, obviously there is an allusion to the king's companion of the chase. The ship beaks, and the Macedonian and Persian arms might point to Hephaestion having been Alexander's faithful helper in the maritime plans and his policy of amalgamation. It was precisely these ideas which were then most profoundly occupying the king. The conclusion of the period of mourning and the solemnities in honor of the new hero were immediately succeeded by the last preparations for the state of the Arabian expedition, which was to follow in a few days. In the meantime, Alexander offered the usual sacrifices for a successful issue, and other sacrifices by direction of the seers, and then celebrated with his friends a feast which lasted the whole night. Greek actors appeared, and he himself took part in the competition by reciting a scene from the Andromeda of Euripides. He also gave a merrymaking to his army and distributed sacrificial flesh and wine among the regiments. When in the morning, it was the 17th of Dionysios by the Macedonian calendar, 2nd of June 323. He was about to go to bed. His friend Medios invited him to his smaller merry party, in which he participated. After having had his sleep out, on the evening of the same day he went again to Medios, and again the party lasted till dawn. This night, between the 17th and 18th of Dionysios, the first symptoms of a fever showed themselves in him. It was the malarial fever which so easily comes on during summer in the marshy district of Babylon. Though Alexander drank little at the symposia, as credible authorities assure us in contradiction to the exaggeration inventions of the hostile tradition, but only kept them going long in order to talk to his friends. Yet the succession of so many festivities, coupled with the extraordinary exertions to which he had subjected himself since his arrival in Babylon, may have weakened his strength to resist the disease. It is touching to follow his struggle with the fatal malady by the journals of these last days, which were drawn up later, probably to refute by an official document the lie that he was poisoned. We see above all how his whole thoughts were devoted to the impending expedition to Arabia. On the 18th of Dionysios, though he had been feverish since night, he sent from his sick bed and ordered to the generals that the infantry should be ready to start on the 22nd, and those sailing with him on the 23rd. On the evening of the 18th, he was carried on a litter from the royal palace, in which he was residing on the west bank, over the Euphrates to the royal gardens, where it was hoped that the fresher air would promote his recovery. And as a result, he seems to have been better on the next day, the 19th. He talked to his friend Medios and played dice with him. He sent orders to the generals to appear next morning. After a feverish night, on the morning of the 20th, he received a report from Nearchus on the state of the preparations for the departure of the fleet and of his experiences on the ocean, and repeated to him and the other generals his order that the fleet should start on the 23rd. Though from the 21st the fever never left him, he sent for the generals again, and ordered that everything should be kept ready for his reception on the fleet and for the start, for he constantly hoped to get better of the disease and to be able to start with the others. But on the 22nd he felt very ill. In spite of that, he spoke to some generals about appointments and again gave orders from this sea voyage. After he had been so ill on the 23rd that he could no longer give his orders about the voyage to the generals in person, it was the day on which he had hoped he would be able to start. On the 24th, he ordered the generals to assemble overnight in the court, and the other officers outside in front of the gates. Evidently, a disquieting change for the worse had set in. Next day, the 25th, as he was getting worse, he had himself conveyed back over the Euphrates to the palace. When the generals came in to him there, he could recognize them, but was not able to utter a word to them. In the night, and the next day, the 26th, the fever became more virulent. As the king this day had seen no one, his troops, especially his Macedonians, became greatly excited. The rumor spread he was dead, and that there was an attempt to keep the news from them. So by threats, they forced the aides de camp on the 27th to open the doors, and now his old companions in arms filed past his couch in a long procession, silent and in deep emotion. He could now only with difficulty nod slightly to individuals and silently greet them with his eyes. It was a touching moment, in which everything was forgotten that had ever come between the king and his people. The friends of Alexander were in despair. Human art could do no more, only the gods could help. They did not turn to a Greek god, but to the principal god of Babylon, Marduk-Bel, who had been from time immemorial venerated as a god of healing. On the evening of the 27th, Dionysius, 6 of his friends went to Marduk to receive in Greek fashion by sleeping in the temple in answer to the question whether it would be better for Alexander to be brought into this temple to be healed by the god as his suppliant. After the end of their sleep, on the morning of the 28th, 13th of June, they received the god's answer. Then Alexander should not be brought into the temple, but it would be better for him to stay where he was. Towards the evening of that day, Alexander closed his eyes forever.